people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Those who are already truly awake understand that we're caught between the proverbial hammer and the anvil. We're caught between a power structure that's completely out of control and doing everything they can to hide the truth, and a majority of the population that unfortunately does not want the truth and is doing all they can to hide from it. This is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org radio, the latest installment of Global Alert News for December 31st, the last day of 2016. The storm is upon us. Wait and see. This commercial-free news hour is brought to you by GeoEngineeringWatch.org, paid for by GeoEngineeringWatch.org. And this show is broadcast on KQMS throughout Northern California on 1670 AM, 99.3 FM, 104.9 FM, and 105.7 FM. Recording of this show can be found at GeoEngineeringWatch.org under the Recent Radio and Top Stories section, also on the KQMS archives. Call-in number if you want to use your phone to listen to any one of the last 5 broadcasts. The PRN radio network on the East Coast, which also broadcasts this news hour, you can call in to their call-in number, which is 1-701-719-0991. That's the PRN radio network. For those in Shasta County and Redding, I want to state again, if you want to know what's happening that you're not being told from mainstream media or the medical industrial complex, pick up a DVD, very informative DVD about vaccinations, how harmful they are. This is hard data in this DVD, and you can get a free copy at Orchard Nutrition. You can also get 9/11 information if you really think that the official story on 9/11 is even plausible. Find out what 2,700 architects and engineers, top professionals from around the globe, have to say about this issue. If you're truly, quote, patriotic, don't you have an obligation to look? And what kind of patriotism is ruling the day at this moment in time? The following is a quote from Samuel Clemens, otherwise known as Mark Twain. Quote, "We have a bastard patriotism, a sarcasm, a theater of the absurd, but we have no such thing as a public conscience." Where is the public consciousness on so many issues? Too distracted with pursuit of material wealth. If that doesn't change soon, nothing else will matter. Also want to encourage listeners to search and look up and view Fluoride, Poison on Tap, full documentary. And we'll be doing a viewing of this documentary in mid to late January at the Reading Library. I'll make more announcements on that soon. We'll have a Q&A after that viewing, by the way, also. So where are we at in the bigger picture? The U.S. media is doing all they can to accuse Russia of hacking Hillary's emails, though so far not a shred of proof has been produced by our government. And what was revealed in those leaks, the releases of the emails, the crimes of the Clintons and the power structure. But let's ask this. What known cyber warfare has the U.S. and Israel long since engaged in that were inarguably acts of war, and that all available evidence indicates actually played a primary part in the still escalating cataclysmic Fukushima meltdown? Cyber warfare engaged in by the U.S. and Israel, Stuxnet. More in this story later in the broadcast. It would be more than bad enough if we just faced a power structure that was completely and totally out of control. But we also face a global environmental and climate implosion. All factors that are in countless ways a direct result of the criminal cabals that currently rule and run the world, and the populations that have made material consumption their priority, and thus we have turned 2 blind eyes to the power structure cancer that has metastasized around the world. Here's a Wikipedia headline that serves as an example of the total delusions that are harbored by many in our species. I'm just trying to give an example of the absurd delusions that are entertained in the science community as if they're in any sense plausible. terraforming of Venus. This is from Wikipedia. The terraforming of Venus is the process of engineering the global environment of the planet Venus in such a way as to make it suitable for human habitation. Think how absurd this is. We can't even preserve the once miraculous planet that we had, and somehow we're going to terraform Venus? And this is the sort of sci-fi mentality that's conditioned into our population so that they don't see what's happening around them. We can't even manage to sustain the incredibly resilient and miraculous planet we had, and yet people are thinking about things like this. Completely absurd. On the weather front, the climate front, yet another massive engineered snowstorm and cool down for the lower 48 has been scheduled by the weather makers. And why such a push to chemically cool things down for the end of 2016 and the start of 2017? Examine the post just put up yesterday at geoengineeringwatch.org titled Geoengineered Winter Weather Whiplash with Patented Climate Engineering Processes. Examine the data in that article and the copies of the patent for some of these processes. If you don't think such weather manipulation is possible, you have not done your research, period. So for those people that are pretending that such chemical cooldowns are natural, they are not natural. Examine the data that surrounds these engineered weather events if you really want to know the truth. There's many headlines I could go over that relate to the global economy. But as I've stated so many times, as the biosphere goes, so must the economy. So must civilization. So must life on Earth. If you're still buying the global economic Ponzi scheme fraud of perpetual growth, pillage, and plunder on a finite planet with finite resources, you're still not awake and are definitely not looking through a clear lens. Politicians and the power structure controlled media would have us believe the economy is what matters. But is that really the truth? The bottom line is this: the state of the environment is the absolute bottom line, period. The environment implodes, everything else implodes with it. Let me go over a few headlines before I get to more in-depth stories on the cyber warfare being conducted by the U.S., that has been conducted by the U.S. and Israel, and the attack on alternative news sources by our government, a really all-out blatant attack, and other stories. First, a few headlines from the Daily Beast. Quote, "It's going to be the warmest Christmas at the North Pole ever." This is from a week ago. From that report, while the North Pole experiences its second record-shattering hot year in a row, the political carnival of dunces continues to sow doubt in Washington. We don't see these headlines from other places around the globe. We only see what's happening in our backyard, the engineered type of events that I just outlined earlier, and I'll go into more detail with in a moment. But we're not seeing the bigger picture, and too many people don't seem to want the bigger picture. They want someone to fortify the beliefs they want to hold. From this Daily Beast post, hopefully Santa's sleigh has mud flaps. While the United States braces for a Christmas snowstorm, the North Pole is set to be 50 degrees warmer than normal, with temperatures approaching above freezing points, enough to melt the snow into a slushy mess at the North Pole. Think about that while we have the major engineered cool down coming next week. And I encourage everyone to look at that article, look at the graphs in that article, look at the data in that article, and try to argue what's happening. You can't. Another headline from California. Quote, "Autism rates in California skyrocket following mandatory vaccination bill." What a surprise. How much carnage will we inflict on our children before people are willing to face facts and dump the official narrative that vaccinations are safe? They are not safe. From this report, according to new statistics, autism rates in California have exploded since the introduction of the mandatory vaccine bill last year. In 2016, the rates of autism in California public schools jumped in general, but rose especially high for kindergarten kids by 17%. That's a staggering figure for a single year. As the Sacramento Bee reported, the number of kids diagnosed as autistic has risen sevenfold, 7 times, 700%. Think about that. Since 2001, when SB 277 went into effect. Many parents with young children who were behind the vaccination schedule or did not start vaccinating yet were forced to catch up, or they could no longer go to a public school. As a result, children received high amounts of vaccinations in a very short period of time. Total systemic overload. All of these injections are toxic. Mercury, aluminum. Why would you inject that into your children's veins? And when you pile those injections up, you're giving a lethal dose, and the autism rates reflect it. How long will the public keep their head in the sand? Again, if you're in Shasta County, go pick up a free copy of Silent Epidemic, The Untold Vaccination Story, and face the truth. If you haven't already harmed your children by these vaccinations, face the truth before any more children are harmed. When it comes, this report continues, when it comes to toxins and vaccinations, the more vaccinations are given at one time, the bigger the risk that the child will experience a severe adverse reaction. Final statement, when we hear of a child left disabled or even dead after receiving vaccinations, it is often after receiving multiple vaccines at a time. How lethal is this bill? Continuing with more headlines. From NDTV, the Arctic is behaving so bizarrely. This is the Arctic heat I referred to earlier. These are all from the last week, by the way. From The Guardian in the UK. Climate disintegration, bad for Arctic. Another headline from the Washington Post. 2016's super warm Arctic winter is extremely unlikely without climate change, scientists say. Do we need scientists to tell us that again? I've commented about that in a lot of shows, that we have teams of scientists to tell us after years of study that, yes, the Greenland ice is melting and it's running into the sea. Do we really need scientists to tell us that? Or other very simplistic things. But why don't we have academicians telling us that vaccinations are harmful, for example, or that putting fluoride into our water is extremely harmful? Because that's a very bad career decision for these academicians. So we don't hear about those things, because the power structure doesn't want us to hear about those things. And in the case of the headlines on the warming, they simply can't hide it anymore. And you have a division in the power structure, by the way, as well. Yes, you have certain portions of the power structure that have to speak of what's happening with the climate to some degree. You can't hide it. But on the other hand, you have the kind of engineered cool downs that are completely confusing and dividing the U.S. population as to the true state of the climate, the weather whiplash. And that should be a big sign. When you have these massive rebounds in temperature, record high to record cold, back to record high, this is not a natural process. And when you look at the temperatures around the globe, it's simply going off the charts everywhere except where there's enough moisture and enough of the right conditions to carry out these engineered cool down events. Look at this data. As I've stated over and over, the Chinese scientists openly announced they were engineering snowstorms, i.e. cool downs. Anyone can look this up. Search Chinese scientists create artificial snowstorm. I've referred to that again and again because China is one of the few governments that mistakenly was open about this until they did $1 billion worth of damage to Beijing, and then they've since gone back under the radar. But other countries around the globe are also engaged in the same order. This is why we see snow happening at the pyramids, snow happening in the Sahara Desert, and all these headlines that convince those who don't want to believe the truth anyway that there's nothing wrong with the climate. In the meantime, the Arctic's imploding, Antarctica's imploding, we have record warm temperatures happening all over Australia right now. Look at the overall picture. That's what matters. And consider climate engineering in the equation. Now, I have some more in-depth stories I want to get into on this particular episode because it absolutely matters. Well, we have the media taking, and the administration as well, taking the steps they're taking to push us further toward global conflict. And the excuse they're using is that Russia hacked the Clinton emails, which, why would that matter, even if it was the case, if it helped expose a crime? But there's no proof of that. None whatsoever that Russia hacked anything. They've offered no proof whatsoever. And what don't we hear about? What don't Americans know about or have forgotten about? Here's the headline. Obama orders sped up wave of cyber attacks against Iran. Now, why does this matter so much? Because it appears to have contributed to a global cataclysm, and that cataclysm is Fukushima. Let me get to that as I get through this first piece. Washington. From his first months in office, President Obama secretly ordered increasingly sophisticated attacks on the computer system that ran Iran's main nuclear enrichment facilities. What would happen if Iran did that to us? What would happen? It would be an immediate act of war. Immediate. In fact, our country couldn't seem to handle when some of our special forces were caught in Iranian waters and released less than 24 hours later. Do you remember how big of a drama was played out in the media by that? And yet we're hacking their nuclear facilities? Do Americans even know that? Let me continue from this report. Significantly expanding America's first sustained use of cyber weapons, according to participants in the program. Report continues. Mr. Obama decided to accelerate the attacks, began in the Bush administration, and codenamed Olympic Games. Even after an element of the program accidentally became public in the summer of 2010 because of the programming error that allowed it to escape Iran's Nance plant, and that's their nuclear plant, and sent it around the world. This is where we get to Fukushima in a moment. On the internet, computer security experts who began studying the worm, which had been developed by the United States and Israel, gave it a name, Stuxnet. At a tense meeting in the White House Situation Room within days of the worm's escape, Mr. Obama's Vice President, Joseph R. Biden, and the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency at the time, Leon Panetta, considered whether America's most ambitious attempt to slow the progress of Iran's nuclear efforts had been fatally compromised. Let's remember, Iran had the legal right to pursue nuclear power. And there is still, to date, absolutely no evidence that they are pursuing anything but that. What would happen if Iran or Russia or anybody else hacked into our nuclear facilities? What would happen? Where does the hypocrisy of our power structure, our media, and the population who follows those sources of deception, where does that hypocrisy end? Continuing from the report, quote, should we shut this thing down? Mr. Obama asked, according to members of the president's national security team who were in the room. Told it was unclear how much the Iranians knew about the code and offered evidence that it was still causing havoc, Mr. Obama decided that the cyber attacks should proceed. In the following weeks, the Natanz plant was hit by a newer version of the computer worm, and then another after that. The last of the series of attacks, a few weeks after the Stuxnet was detected around the world, temporarily took out nearly 1,000 of its 5,000 centrifuges. Iran had spinning at the time to purify uranium. What if that had caused a nuclear meltdown? Is this not an act of war? And yet we have our country pushing Russia toward war because they're accused, with no proof whatsoever, of hacking Hillary's emails. Again, unimaginable hypocrisy. Last paragraph from this report. This account of the American and Israeli effort to undermine the Iranian nuclear program is based on an interview over the past 18 months with current and former American, European, and Israeli officials involved in the program, as well as a range of outside experts. None would allow their names to be used because the effort remains highly classified, and part of it continues to this day. We don't hear about that. We don't hear anything about any of this. And this is not to say, this is not a condoning of the Iranian government or the Russian government. It's simply stating that we are committing acts of war against these governments. We're putting weapons along their borders in the case of Russia, toppling country after country along their borders. What would we do? What would Americans do if Russia was toppling countries on our border and moving weapons in? What would we do if Russia hacked our nuclear facilities or Iran hacked our nuclear facilities? The hypocrisy in this country is absolutely mind-numbing, and those who don't want to know the truth are a part of the problem. Final statements again from this report. It appears to be the first time that the United States has repeatedly used cyber weapons to cripple another country's infrastructure, achieving with computer code what until then could be accomplished only by bombing a country or sending its agents into plant explosives. And all of this fits into what I've stated since this radio show began. The grand chessboard. Brzezinski, advisor to presidents all the way back to Johnson, the plan of toppling Middle Eastern and Eurasian countries, for the purpose of expanding empire and controlling resources. All of this is in that category. Yet, when we see our military commercials, and how many do we see over and over, and especially on sources of disinformation like the Weather Channel that hides the climate engineering processes, what do we see? Military commercials over and over, painting the military as, quote, a source for good, defending our freedom, defending our democracy. It has nothing to do with that. And I appeal to our military brothers and sisters to understand and face the fact that you are being used for paid mercenaries. Paid mercenaries for those in power to continue their hegemonic agenda. That's what you're being used for. That's not fulfilling your oath to the country or the Constitution. It's not. These are harsh truths, but I remind listeners as well, the hallmark of a healthy mind is an unyielding willingness to face the truth, no matter how dire. That's a healthy mind. Hiding from the truth, clinging to a false pattern of patriotism that's not patriotism at all, but simply tyranny. The might is right mentality. That's not patriotism. If you care about what's right, face the truth. Final statements from this report again. Mr. Obama, according to participants in the mini Situation Room meetings on the Olympic Games, which is the computer virus program, the cyber attacks, was acutely aware that with every attack he was pushing the United States into new territory, much as his predecessors had with the first use of atomic weapons in the 1940s, of intercontinental missiles in the 1950s, and of drones in the past decade. Can you imagine Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize? Again, more hypocrisy. Can't imagine that. He, Obama, repeatedly expressed concerns that any American acknowledgement that it was using cyber weapons, even under the most careful and limited circumstances, could enable other countries and terrorists or hackers to justify their own attacks. Of course, just like the U.S. torture programs, correct? Same example. Continuing with the report, then the NSA, National Security Agency, and a secret Israeli unit respected by American intelligence officials for its cyber skills set to work on developing the enormously complex computer worm that would become the attacker from within. Soon the two countries had developed a complex worm that the Americans called the bug. The architects of the Stuxnet computer attack virus would meet him, Obama, in the Situation Room, often with what they called, quote, the horse blanket, a giant fold-out schematic diagram of Iran's nuclear production facilities. Mr. Obama authorized the attacks to continue, and every few weeks, certainly after a major attack, he would get updates and authorize the next step. Sometimes it was a strike riskier and bolder than what had been tried previously. An error in the code, they said, had led it to spread to an engineer's computer when it was hooked up to the centrifuges. When the engineer left Natanz and connected the computer to the internet, the American and Israeli-made bug failed to recognize that its environment had changed. It began replicating itself all around the world. Suddenly the code was exposed through the internet, and it would not be clear, at least to ordinary computer users. Quote, we think there was a modification done by the Israelis, one of the briefers told the president, and we don't know if we were a part of that activity. Where is all this leading? This cyber attack, this computer virus created by the U.S. and Israel was likely a part of the reason that the safety systems on Fukushima did not work. And now we face a nuclear cataclysm with no technology to fix it and no end in sight. And the American population has no clue how this chain of events happened. Finishing this report, Mr. Obama, according to the officials in the room, asked a series of questions, fearful that the code could do damage outside the plant, as I just described. The answers came back in hedged terms. Mr. Biden fumed. Quote, it's got to be the Israelis, he said. They went too far. Again, from Joe Biden. Within a week, another version of the U.S.-Israeli computer virus brought down just under 1,000 centrifuges. The cyber war against Iran was still on. American cyber attacks are not limited to Iran, but the focus of attention, as one administration official put it, has been overwhelmingly on one country. There is no reason to believe that will remain the case for long. Some officials question why the same techniques have not been used more aggressively against North Korea. Certainly they have. We just don't know about it yet. Others see chances to disrupt Chinese military plans, forces in Syria on the way to suppress the uprising there, etc. Continuing, Mr. Obama has repeatedly told his aides that there are risks to using and particularly overusing the weapon. In fact, no country's infrastructure is more dependent on computer systems and thus more vulnerable to attack than that of the United States. It's only a matter of time, most experts believe, before it becomes a target of the same kind of weapon that the Americans have used secretly against Iran and other countries. And the U.S. population has no clue. No clue about any of this going on, because we're not told, because our media is simply a tool for the power structure to hide and cover up the truth, to spin the truth, or completely fabricate what is claimed to be the truth, to condition the population to go along with whatever those in power want. Back to 9/11, how much bigger example could we have of an event that was designed to galvanize the American population to blindly follow the power structure's plans. And all we hear is terror, terror, terror. And yet, do we really believe, what sane person could believe that this event could be carried out by a diabetic Arab in a cave somewhere in Afghanistan? That he could orchestrate all this and outmaneuver the most sophisticated military on the planet? And that buildings that were designed to take multiple impacts from a fully loaded 707, which is a larger, heavier aircraft than the aircraft that hit those towers, and they were designed to take multiple impacts, and yet they collapsed at free fall speed from a single impact. Building 7 never got hit by anything. No aircraft. Some furniture burning in the first floor, and a 47-story steel structure high-rise building came down at free fall speed. For those listening, if you have any courage at all, you'll go to the internet and view World Trade Center Building 7 collapse. You look at that film of a building collapsing in 7 seconds, free fall speed, never got hit by anything, and try to convince yourself that the official story is true, that doesn't even address Building 7. And this is, again, the license by which the U.S. has conducted their hegemonic aggression, and other countries around the world pushing the planet's life support systems and pushing global equilibrium off the scale, pushing us toward World War III. And now we know the cyber weapons. Who has really been waging cyber warfare against countries around the globe? The U.S. and Israel. I want to finish and weave this all together. What part did the U.S.-Israeli Stuxnet virus, again, play in the global cataclysm of Fukushima that continues to worsen, as I stated earlier, with no end in sight, no technology to fix it? Here's a headline from the news source foreignpolicy.com, weaving this together again with the Stuxnet virus that escaped. No surprise that the U.S. and Israel put together. Here's the headline from foreignpolicy.com, Where Fukushima Meets Stuxnet, the Growing Threat of Cyber War. From this report, the way to look at this story is to link in your mind the Stuxnet revelations about the U.S. and Israel-led cyber attacks on the Iranian nuclear enrichment facility at Natanz and the calamities at the Fukushima power facilities. Another headline, follow-up story, weaving this together. Fukushima, U.S.-Israeli Stuxnet sabotages thermometers and water treatment. With every new report and article coming from the establishment and alternative media about Fukushima, Japan, the gap between their fake reality, the official source's fake reality, and the real truth keeps growing further, and has now become so wide that it seems to be very unlikely that the establishment, power structure-owned corporate media will ever disclose the real facts about Fukushima in their reporting on that issue. Continuing, ever since the earthquake hit Japan on March 11, 2011, the cover-up of the actual causes, the eco-terror, the nuclear attacks, and the sabotage has been tightly scripted and expanded by the media, the USGS, the NRC, the Israeli Magna BSP, and the United Nations, the EU, even World Wildlife Foundation and Greenpeace. None of them reporting the truth. Continuing from this report, obviously it can be expected that also the problems in the aftermath of the proven eco-terror, the nuclear attacks, and the sabotage will be shrouded in lies and deception. Sadly, we don't expect any other behavior. This is referring to the safety systems of Fukushima that did not function and the involvement of Stuxnet in what happened there, the cyber warfare virus created by US and Israel. Continuing from the report, quote, practically all the ongoing reports about the leaking of water, about pumps and valves that were malfunctioning or were, quote, forgotten to be switched properly, and about failing thermometers at the Fukushima power station are missing the same crucial piece of information. Continuing from the report, it has already been confirmed since at least 2010 and in multiple ways that Stuxnet, the malware virus, again, created by the US and Israel, infected and continues to sabotage the Fukushima nuclear power station by attacking the Siemens SCADA control system. Report continues. The same Stuxnet is also responsible for sabotaging the thermometers in the nuclear reactors that continue to fail, like is the case in Unit 2, falsely blamed on workers who, quote, cripple the instruments. Thermometers, like those in Fukushima, are operated through and linked to the SCAD control systems, which are still infected with Stuxnet. This means that also the thermometers are exposed to the Stuxnet infection. Cyber warfare gone completely out of control, created by, in this case, the US and Israel. And we have the US media demonizing Russia, pushing us toward World War III for disclosing Hillary Clinton's crimes with no proof that Russia even did this. And yet this kind of story is completely forgotten, that not only did this virus, could have this virus not potentially have caused a nuclear cataclysm in Iran, but it appears to be connected to the triple meltdown nuclear cataclysm in Fukushima, with all these safety systems failing, with the Stuxnet virus present and known to be responsible for this type of shutdown. And we don't hear anything about this. Fukushima, all other things aside, if Fukushima continues, it could kill us all. And we now know who's responsible for much of what has likely happened there. And the American public has no clue. Final paragraph from this report. Fukushima is so important to those who have created this mess by committing eco-terror and engaging in war crimes. In this way, full control can be kept remotely, which is necessary when Japan is to be held hostage firmly as they slowly lose credibility in the international community for a disaster they didn't even create. I covered this in a previous story or report on GeoEngineering Watch News, that we had extremely anomalous occurrences with atmospheric heating over the epicenters reported by one of the world's most recognized research institutions, MIT, in the days prior to the quake. Same thing in New Zealand. When you have an institution like MIT reporting something that is so anomalous and can really only be connected to the ionosphere heaters, part of the global weather modification environmental warfare mechanism of the US military and NATO. And we had Japan at the same time this whole cataclysm occurred, including the Fukushima disaster, was beginning to ally with its regional partners. And after these events occurred, Japan was back in the hip pocket of the US. Is this all just a coincidence? And the bottom line is, in regard to the Stuxnet virus, how much more proof of cyber terror do we need? And now we have an unimaginable cataclysm still unfolding. Much of the American population is completely oblivious to the fact that Fukushima has not gone away. It's only getting worse. Only getting worse rapidly. Poisoning the entire Pacific Ocean, which is all the world's oceans, because they're all connected. Pumping an unimaginable amount of radiation into the sky. Fukushima is an unimaginable cataclysm. And it appears that the Stuxnet virus was a part of that cataclysm, thanks to the US and Israel. And as far as the UN resolutions that are violated, in this case by Israel, because this is an ongoing situation right now, as many may have seen in the news, the latest violation. And now the US we have the whole world. We have 170 or 80 countries voting on the illegal occupations that are occurring. And yet we have no real coverage of that by U.S. media. Why is that? Let's try to answer that right now. AIPAC, the Israeli lobby, the most powerful U.S. lobby on a pro-Israel mission from that report. They're the most sophisticated, effective lobby interest group in Washington, without a doubt. Aaron David Miller, an advisor to several U.S. Secretaries of State and now scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Institute International Center, told American Free Press that AIPAC has indisputably emerged as the most influential foreign policy lobby in the United States, eclipsing the traditional powerhouse lobbies for domestic gun rights, oil, and retirees. That's quite a statement, isn't it? So we have the U.S. now, who just voted, or abstained from the vote on the continuing establishment of occupation on Palestinian lands. And Netanyahu just told the Israeli cabinet a week ago Sunday that the resolution that was put forward by the U.S. was reckless and destructive. He called the U.S. abstention from the vote instead of a veto, quote, shameful. So we have elements in our government now refusing to go along. We have a fracturing in the power structure, and this is what is so important about what I'm trying to lay out here. As conditions become ever more difficult to sustain, we have biosystems imploding around the globe. There's not enough to go around, and now we see a fracturing in the power structure. So now we see the U.S. even voting in a manner that has upset Israel. Now, should we wonder why Israel gets $30 billion a year in U.S. military aid? Should we question that? Should any country, including Israel, be considered beyond questioning, beyond examination, beyond investigation? That answer is clear. No country should be above or beyond being accountable. No country. And we find ourselves in a situation where so few are willing to look at the facts, and they operate on their biases, their preconceptions, their dichotomous thinking. We're good, they're bad. This sort of simplistic mindset that's been programmed into our society, period. And because we don't agree with certain belief systems in certain countries, does that justify the actions that our government and others have taken against these countries? Does that justify almost creating a nuclear meltdown in Iran, who is pursuing, based on all available evidence, nuclear power, which they have a right to do? They allowed inspections. Would we allow Iran to come and inspect our nuclear facilities? That's a ludicrous question, because the answer is obviously no. Of course not. Not Iran or anybody else. That's not allowed. But they are allowed inspections of their facilities. Saddam Hussein got rid of his weapons of mass destruction. They were never found. And we know that everything we were fed was lies on top of lies on top of lies. He allowed inspections. And I'm not saying Saddam was a great guy. Again, this is back to the dichotomous thinking. People try to defend their sort of dogmatic thinking by if you try to make the case that this invasion of Iraq was wrong, and it was wrong, that somehow you must be a Saddam Hussein fan. That's not true. Saddam Hussein was a tyrant. So why did we arm the tyrant in the 90s and late 80s? Why do we have Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with the tyrant? Why? Because he was a useful tyrant to the U.S. at that point, just like other dictators are useful to the U.S. now, like the dictators in Saudi Arabia, who get weapons from the U.S. and then bomb innocent civilians in Yemen. This is nothing more than criminal cabals operating as official governments. That's what we have. The American public needs to wake up to this fact, and if the American population thinks that they are somehow on the inside of the circle and their government cares about them, those who really operate the government. I'm not talking about our military brothers and sisters who, of course, care about their families and fellow citizens, but they're being used as tools by those behind the curtain who don't care at all for the American population. And thus back to the weather warfare, highly toxic, which is certainly biological warfare as well, that's being conducted in U.S. skies, sickening and causing countless mortality, with the American population. And this is not a question, it's not hypothesis, it's not theory. We know what's raining down through the air column. We know the elements match climate engineering patterns exactly. This is the same as biological warfare being carried out against the U.S. population by the U.S. government. And when we have organizations like ours at geoengineeringwatch.org that are trying to get the truth out and encouraging people to please don't believe anything we say or report or post, please simply investigate those facts. That's all we're asking. Do you hear corporate media asking you to investigate their facts ever? No. What you hear now from the power structure is they're making every possible move to shut down any source of independent data because they know they're losing control. They know people are starting to wake up and realize they've been duped to a degree that can barely be imagined on every front, and that the crimes committed by those in power are so heinous, so egregious, so catastrophic that literally all life on Earth is at question at this point. And we have a population that has been all too willing to turn two blind eyes to this, so long as they could keep mortgaging their house, using it for an ATM, buying new cars, pursuing material wealth at any cost to the planet or their children's futures. That's the society we've had. That must change. But how can we get this information out when we have a very concerted and extremely alarming effort at this point to shut down independent sources of media? On that note, on to the next story. Quote, Obama quietly signs the, quote, Countering Disinformation and Propaganda Act. What is disinformation and propaganda? Anything that doesn't agree with the official narrative of lies. That's what it means. We are plunging into an Orwellian police state. From this report from a week ago Friday, not yesterday, but the Friday before. Late on Friday, with the U.S. population embracing the upcoming holidays and oblivious of most of the news emerging from the administration, Obama quietly signed into law the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, which authorizes $611 billion for the military in 2017. But while the passage of the NDAA and the funding of the U.S. military was hardly a surprise, the biggest news is what was buried deep inside the provisions of the Defense Authorization Act. Recall what was reported in June. Quote, a bill to implement the U.S.'s very own de facto Ministry of Truth has been quietly introduced into Congress. This was reported months ago. The Ministry of Truth is what we're talking about here, where the government decides and tells you what's true and what's not, and you have no right to question that. That's an Orwellian police state. Continuing from the report, as with any legislation attempting to dodge the public's spotlight, the Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act, these acts always sound very rational. That's the point. Doesn't mean they are, just like the, quote, Patriot Act, which was anything but patriotic. And the American public falls for this, unfortunately. Let's hope that changes. The Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act of 2016 marks further curtailment of press freedom. It is yet another attempt to shut down any other avenues of accurate information. Report continues. Introduced by Congressman Adam Kinzinger and Ted Lieu, H.R. 5181 seeks, quote, a whole government approach without the bureaucratic restrictions, end quote, to counter disinformation and manipulation, which they believe threaten the world's security and stability. Listen to what I just said. Without any form of bureaucratic restrictions, they can do whatever they want if this passes. They can shut down whoever they want. This is total control. This is tearing the Constitution up and throwing it out the window. This is tearing democracy up and throwing it out the window, which has been going on for a long time already, and this is happening now. The American public must take a stand, or we will lose any freedom we have. We will lose any source of credible frontline information. Continuing from the report, also called the Countering Information Warfare Act of 2016, S2692, when introduced in March by Senator Rob Portman, the legislation represents a dramatic return to Cold War-era government propaganda battles. That's exactly what's happening, because the internet is exposing the crimes of the power structure, and they don't like it. And when people like Rob Portman and so many like him, the whole system and everyone involved in the system is bought, sold, and paid for. And even our local Congressman Doug LaMalfa and his representatives, who were given very substantial data on the climate engineering issue, his representatives called me at home. His assistants were calling me at home to complain about the climate engineering, and something came from up the ladder for them to shut down and shut up. And they did in a complete about-face, completely hiding from this issue. And even when I served Senator LaMalfa, as he requested, data from a credible source, Sacramento EPA, proving the heavy metals contamination like aluminum in our tributaries, served that to Senator LaMalfa. And you can see this on film, by the way. Search Confronting a Congressman. Search geoengineeringwatch.org, Confronting a Congressman, and you'll see me serving Congressman LaMalfa information from Sacramento EPA, which he and his staff then later also ignored, saying they don't recognize that as a credible source of data. And this is what we have. We have quote-unquote elected officials behaving as complete tyrants for the power structure. They decide what's true, what's not. They decide what's real, what's not, and they ignore anything or hide anything or marginalize anything that doesn't support the official narrative from the power structure. And if you think it's okay to live in that kind of a state, you'll find out very soon just how dire our situation is. When those in power shut down any other source of news or information, we will be flying blind, completely in the dark, and completely at the mercy of those in power. And that's where we're headed, at blinding speed. Continuing from this report, long before the, quote, fake news, again, which means any news source that doesn't go along with the official narrative, long before the fake news meme became a daily topic of extensive conversation on such discredited mainstream portals as CNN, Fox, and others, H.R. 5181 would task the Secretary of State with coordinating the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Broadcasting Board of Governors to, quote, establish a center of informational analysis and response, end quote, which will pinpoint sources of disinformation, which again means any source of information that doesn't agree with the official narrative, and then to analyze data and in true dystopic manner, quote, develop and disseminate a, quote, fact-based narrative to counter what the government considers to be fake news. What the government considers to be fake news. Passed by Obama over a week ago. What's the American population doing? And over the holidays, when they knew the population would be busy with their own personal pursuits, as I've stated over and over, while the ship goes down. What does it take? We are in absolute free fall. Our government and the criminal cabal that runs our government is taking over, literally taking over. And the population remains asleep at the wheel, focused on things that don't matter. And when I say that, I'm speaking to organizations as diverse as from the Tea Party to the Green Party. I'm speaking to all of them because those two opposite ends of the spectrum and everybody in between, the vast majority, are focused on issues that don't matter in the bigger picture context. They don't matter. In and of themselves, they might matter, but they don't matter in the bigger picture context. This would be like, the issues that many people are focusing on would be like polishing the rails on the deck of the ship as the ship sinks, as you're knee-deep in water. What's the most important priority? To plug the leaks in the ship. Our biosphere is imploding. Our government is pushing us toward World War III, engaged in cyber warfare that has caused unimaginable cataclysms that can't be cured now. Fukushima can't be cured. And yet we have our media trying to galvanize the population to support World War III against countries that have not created this situation. And we have a population that seems so far willing to support that. The American population has to wake up. I hear so many people that want to put all the blame on the criminals in power. We know criminals always gravitate toward power. They do things that the rest of us wouldn't do. They crave to feel some emptiness inside them by feeling powerful. and having power and control over others. We know this about those types of people. They're clinically insane. This is a psychological fact. But we have a population that is so incredibly willing to remain in denial that they've facilitated this, so the population bears so much of the blame as well. We must change directions. Continuing from this report, here is the statement issued by the generously funded Senator Rob Portman, getting back to our, quote, elected officials that are simply part of the criminal power structure at this point. Rob Portman from Ohio, on the signing into law of a bill that further chips away at press liberties in the U.S. and which sets the stage for a future which hunts and locates and finds websites to shut down purely as a result of an accusation that any one media outlet or site is considered as a source of, quote, disinformation and propaganda and is thus shut down by the government. This list of, quote, fake news sites has already been put out, about 200 news sites on that, and GeoEngineering Watch was near the top. Climate engineering is one of the issues that they most don't want to come to light. It can't be hidden much longer. But I ask again, how many times do I say, please investigate what I say? Please do real investigation, don't believe me. Do you hear any corporate news source saying this? Do you hear our government saying this? Do you hear our government saying, please investigate us, we have nothing to hide? Never. Never. In fact, what you hear them saying is what I've just read. They want to shut down anyone that dares disagree with their official false narrative. Once that happens, we'll be completely blind. Final statements from this report. The use of propaganda to undermine democracy has hit a new low, but now we are finally in a position to confront this threat head on and get out the truth. By building up independent, objective journalism in places like Eastern Europe, the US, and elsewhere, we can start to fight back by exposing the real fake narratives and empowering local communities to protect themselves. That's what we have to do. We must stand together and start confronting the purveyors of power structure propaganda, like the Record Searchlight, like KRCR, and so many people feel so warm and cozy about our local media. They know these people, they know some of the people that work at these places. Does that make what they're doing right? Does that make it right? The kind of official government narratives they report and what they don't report, like the massive events in Reading that I went over again and again, events that contain 1,000 participants or attendees from all over the country, government scientists, former government scientists, and no coverage whatsoever about climate engineering, with so many experts present, so much of the population present, total blackout from the Record Searchlight and KRCR, and now they're going to have a license to do that? To completely shut down any sort of truth. They push the official narrative on everything from vaccinations to climate engineering to why we're going to war. This is a recipe for certain near-term total global omnicide. If that's what you want, if you sit down on the bench and do nothing, if you don't help us to get the word out, that's what you're going to get. Another timeless quote from Mark Twain puts our current collective predicament into context. The glory which is built upon a lie soon becomes a most unpleasant encumbrance. How easy it is to make people believe in a lie, and how hard it is to undo that work again. That's where we're at. Mark Twain knew it. Nothing has changed. The power structure has simply become far more powerful. And now they're attempting to gain total control over the flow of information. We're there. Trouble's not off on the horizon somewhere. It's kicking the door in on every front. We face a collapsing biosphere and climate system. We have power structures that are unimaginably desperate, that are fracturing, as we saw between the U.S. and Israel, that's starting to occur now, and other countries. We have cyber warfare going on. We have a push toward World War III, toward global conflict, as that is always the last option for a desperate power structure. 2017 is to be a year of converging catastrophes. There is little doubt about this. What matters is what we do or don't do. Will each of us choose to do everything in our power to be a part of the solution? Or will we allow fear and complacency to dictate our behavior? Will we choose to be a part of the cure or part of the disease? That choice belongs to each of us, and no one can take it. No one can take our will. It belongs to each of us alone. We owe to our children our total dedication to the fight for the greater good. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org.
is Ozzy's Cake.